Welcome. Today's presentation is Public Executions and Persecutions of Pirates with Dr. Rebecca Steinman, hosted by Forever Scholars. My name is Anthony Hannon, and I'll be the moderator for the next hour. So this evening's lecture is going to run for about 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session for a total of 60 minutes. If you have questions during the lecture, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will address them during the Q&A session. This session is being recorded, and it will be available for on-demand viewing after today's session. And we do have two special offers today. One is we are offering a signed copy of Dr. Simon's book, Why We Love Pirates, The Hunt for Captain Kidd, and How He Changed Piracy Forever. You can order this book for $27 plus shipping, and we'll drop the direct link to the book now in the chat. And then our other offer is our 5-week live online course, The Golden Age of Piracy with Dr. Rebecca Simon, which is $295 and starts in 2 weeks on Monday, February 21st. And for tonight only, if you register for the course, we're going to send you a copy of Dr. Simon's book signed. And everyone that is already registered for that course will be getting the book as well. So if you'd like to learn more and register, we are dropping a direct link to that course in the chat window now. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Simon, who is a historian of early modern piracy, colonial America, the Atlantic world, and maritime history. She earned her PhD from King's College London. Her dissertation entitled The Crimes of Piracy and Its Punishment, the Performance of Maritime Supremacy in the British Atlantic World, examines British maritime and legal supremacy in its early American colonies in regards to maritime piracy. Dr. Simon has written numerous articles for History Today, BBC History, Revealed, and other online publications. She has appeared on numerous podcasts such as You're Dead to Me, History Hit, and History Extra. She was featured in History Channel's The Curse of Oak Island and Beyond Oak Island, and Netflix's docudrama, The Lost Pirate Kingdom. She is the author of Why We Love Pirates, The Hunt for Captain Kidd, and How He Changed Piracy Forever. And her next book, Pirate Queens, The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, will be published by Pen and Sword History in 2022. You can find more about Dr. Rebecca Simon at foreverscholars.com by visiting her faculty profile. And now, without further delay, welcome, Dr. Simon. We are so happy to have you here, and the Zoom floor is now yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here to present a lecture about public executions and persecutions of piracy, which was, like Anthony just said, the subject of my doctorate. So before I get started, a quick caveat: since I am talking about publications and persecutions, just know I will be going into a little bit of detail about the gruesome reality of a public execution. And there's, I think, a couple of images of hangings from the 18th century. So just kind of a caveat for that. So that way you're not too surprised in case something like that might bother you. But let's go ahead. I'm going to quickly share my screen. All right, so public executions and persecutions of pirates. So, all right, so I just want to kind of run over quickly what I'm going to be talking about today. So these are kind of the essential questions of what I like people to be able to take away from a lecture of sorts. So first off, we're going to look at what is the public execution process and why it's important. And we also are going to have to look at what exactly is a pirate, and why are we also looking at the 18th century when piracy has lasted forever? What was the High Court of Admiralty, which is the legal ruling body? Kind of just answered it, but we'll go into more detail. Why were pirates given unique treatment when they were punished and prosecuted? And how and why were laws and executions different in London and the American colonies? So this is what I'm going to be discussing in today's lecture. In 1699, an ex-privateer known as Captain William Kidd was captured and imprisoned in Boston for crimes of piracy against the East India Company and merchant ships in the East Indies. After 2 miserable cold years languishing in prison, the High Court of Admiralty transported him back to London into Newgate Prison, where he would await his trial. Kidd was the first pirate to receive consistent live news coverage, having been captured in the North American colonies and transferred across the ocean for trial. Newspaper readers were informed of Kidd's trials in advance. Quote, "We hear that on the 18th of next month, which was May, a sessions of Admiralty will be held at the Old Bailey for trying of several pirates and 'tis thought that Captain Kidd will then come to his trial. Now, Kidd maintained his innocence all throughout the trial, which is very common. Pretty much every single pirate put on trial always said that they were completely innocent of their crimes. However, the catch is, just like all other pirates, Captain Kidd was assumed guilty before he could ever really take the stand. So, as a result, he was indeed found guilty, and he was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead at a place called Execution Dock in the East London neighborhood, Wapping, which is situated on the Thames. When asked if he had any final words to declare, he said, "I have nothing to say, but that I have been sworn against by perjured and wicked people." His protests went unanswered, unfortunately, and he met his death on the 23rd of May in 1701. He received the harsher punishment meant for pirates for a public hanging, a shorter noose that caused death by strangulation rather than a broken neck. Kidd's body was tarred and strung up in a gibbet for all to see and to serve as a warning to any would-be pirate. His body remained on display for at least 3 years, and some historians estimate up to 20 years. Now, the condemnation and capture of Captain Kidd signified differences between the punishments of piracy and those of land-based criminals. His execution also indicated changes within the early modern British government as it was establishing its overseas colonies. The High Court of Admiralty began persecuting pirates at an unprecedented speed, unlike the likes of which history had ever seen. Pirates had separate trials from other criminals, and their public executions took place on the river rather than directly in town, or the infamous Tyburn Tree in West London. So this brings up the questions that I discussed a few minutes ago, and we're going to go ahead and answer those. So let's get into some of these details as we take a look at what we call the war on piracy. So first off, what are pirates? That is the big question. Now, it's easy to imagine pirates, such as these guys right here, as swashbuckling anti-heroes on the hunt for buried treasure, sticking it to the man, going against all authority. So we conjure up images such as Long John Silver, Jack Sparrow, and various other characters from other forms of pop culture media, such as Captain Flint from the television show Black Sails. These characters are sly, they're cunning, they're fashionable, they say "Arr, matey," they're dangerous, and they have fun adventures on the high seas. But piracy is not really, in pop culture, piracy is not about being a criminal. It's a calling or a way of life. But what's the reality? The reality here that being a pirate is much more complicated because people became pirates for numerous reasons. They perhaps could not get any job elsewhere. They might have already been a persecuted criminal, or they might be on the run from the law. They could be a former enslaved person who can't get work anywhere, or an escaped enslaved person. Someone perhaps trying to escape bad conditions on a merchant or naval ship. Pirate ships generally could be better places because they were more egalitarian. They could vote for their captains. They all had to sign articles proving their loyalty with specific rules to keep order on the ship. And they also would have better access to fresher food and drink because of all the plunder. Now, but to go back a little bit, come on. There we go. Now, to go back a little bit, piracy has been around ever since the beginning of human time. People ask me this all the time: when were pirates? And the answer is as soon as we figured out how to sail on a boat. They would terrorize their own regions or sail far and wide, and their motivations were different: conquering, perhaps plundering, anything. For instance, if we go back to the ancient world, it's popular that the sea peoples, illustrated here, who were a mysterious group of marauders that brought down all the major Mesopotamian empires over a period of 200 years, might have been bands of pirates over several generations. The Roman philosopher Cicero wrote a lot about pirates, and he referred to them as hostis, humanis, generis, meaning enemies of all mankind, which would be one of the defining features of maritime law against piracy during the golden age of piracy. Speaking of which, for the context of our lecture today, however, this is the time period we're focusing on, not ancient history. So first off, what is the golden age of piracy? This was a period of time during the mid-17th century until about the first quarter of the 18th century, when there were organized bands of pirates throughout the Atlantic world, or specifically the British colonies in the Caribbean and North America. Now, the historian Marcus Rediker, who is a brilliant pirate historian, he's identified 3 specific pirate rounds from the time period that most historians subscribe by. So the first one, this is known as the buccaneering period, which is about the 1650s to the 1670s in the Caribbean. These are mostly French pirates, but you can also accurately say that the term buccaneer is synonymous for pirate or interchangeable. But why do we use this term? It really comes from a French term called boucanier, and this refers to the methods of how they would roast meat. There were bands of pirates that would kind of sail throughout the Caribbean, hunting wild boar. And what's interesting is that they were known to cook the meat on the ship, which was very unusual because that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. But the most important thing to know about them is the context. You see, for about 20 years between 1650 and 1670, Britain and Spain were engaged in what's called the Anglo-Spanish War, which was about who could control the plantation islands in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica. You see, wartime is fantastic for pirates, because especially in a politically unstable region like the West Indies. You see, major governments and authorities are distracted by war, and they're stretched way too thin on all fronts to be able to combat piracy properly. Jamaica was the most desirable plantation island, specifically because of its proximity to other islands, the numerous ports, and the wealth that came out of loads of cultivation, especially sugar, when the slave trade increased. Not only that, it was controlled by the Spanish, and Britain loved any excuse to take down the Spanish. So, because of this war, many people who immigrated to the Caribbean were kind of unregulated populations, and they were people who civilized society would deem to be undesirable. These were indentured servants, enslaved people, prostitutes, vagrants, and of course, pirates. So many buccaneers terrorized various plantation islands, but many of them also played a part in the war in the Anglo-Spanish War as privateers, meaning they sailed under a contract known as a letter of marque, where they had specific orders from a specific government to attack specific enemy ships. Very specified here. In return, these privateers were able to keep about 30%, or I'm sorry, about 80% of all of their loot. When the war ended in 1670, some semblance of order came back to the Caribbean, and the buccaneering period faded out. Then we get to the second round of piracy, and this is further east now. We're heading eastward because this second round is about British piracy within the East Indies, near India. And we're specifically talking about Captain Henry Avery and Captain William Kidd, who I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. The former, he was known to terrorize the Indian Mughal ships, and he nearly obliterated all trade and any cordial relationships that the British East India Company had been establishing for quite some time with the Indian Mughal emperor. This happened in 1695 when Henry Avery captured a major ship. It's possible he may have married an Indian princess. If he did, most likely he kidnapped her. And this also really angered the Mughal Empire. Of course, this itself is a whole multi-lecture topic, so I can't go into too much detail for the sake of time. But what's really interesting about Henry Avery is that his fate is actually quite unknown. We don't know what happened, whether or not he was killed. He may have retired in disguise in Madagascar off the coast of Africa, which was a known pirate haven at the time. He may have been killed, or he was from Bristol, England. He may have gone back there and died penniless, as some believe. We'll never know. The only things we really know about him come from his crew, because the majority of his crew were captured and put on trial throughout North America, because a lot of them went to North America for safe haven, because places like Philadelphia, parts of Boston, and Providence, Rhode Island were known to be, and I quote, receptacles of piracy. So the vast majority of them were captured, tried, and executed in 1697. Now, Captain Kidd is a little bit more complicated. I'm sure there's some people in the lecture here who are kind of like, why is Dr. Simon saying he's a pirate? He wasn't. This is a very heavily debated topic. So that's why it's so interesting. Now, here's the thing. He was a privateer. Remember, he's got a government commission. He's a privateer for the East India Company, set out to capture any sort of competitive ships, such as French or Dutch ships, anyone who was competing with Britain for trade or anyone who could be an enemy. Now, he's been a privateer for a long time. He's kind of got a reputation for being a bit rash and a little hard to control, always kind of towing the line of violating his letter of marque. But he was very good at his job and he had a lot of financiers. He married wealthy and became part of New York's high society, which is not bad for a poor Scottish sailor. Now, in 1698, he and his men were sailing around the East Indies, and the voyage is not going well. They haven't made many good attacks. They haven't plundered very many prizes. So they have to land in Madagascar to try to get new provisions. But the problem is there's been an outbreak of cholera, and many of the crew get sick and have to leave. And there are some who completely abandon his ship. So he had to try to get new crew. The rest who stayed were kind of on the brink of mutiny because they still thought that Captain Kidd was passing up too many good ships and that they weren't making any money. Finally, they spot a ship called the Quetta Merchant. Kidd supposedly, as he said in his trial, did not want to attack it, but he did to prevent any mutiny. They thought it was an Armenian ship, but it turned out to be captained by an Englishman. So that's a big oops because Kidd had attacked and stolen a ship that was helmed by one of his own countrymen. This was a massive violation of the letter of marque. Not only that, he got in a fight with one of his crewmates, William Moore, who he hit with a metal bucket, cracked Moore's skull, who died the next day. Kidd claimed it was an accident, but we'll never actually know. Little did he himself know that word had gotten out about his robberies, and the Mughals were threatening to stop all trade if Britain did not capture him. So they could not make the same mistake they'd done with Henry Avery. So a whole manhunt is carried out here. Kidd realizes he's wanted for piracy and he pleads for help. He's lured to Boston for safety when he's captured and thrown into prison. Now, around this time, so he's executed in 1701, and about this time, piracy goes on pause. Why? This is because the War of Spanish Succession breaks out in 1701. The King of Spain, Charles II, died without an heir, and the next in line would be from the Austrian Habsburg family or the French Bourbon family, which divided Europe in terms of loyalty. Britain and other countries did much of their fighting at sea, and they needed a lot of skilled sailors who could fight. So pirates were promised a full pardon of all crimes if they agreed to work as privateers, and many jumped at the chance. Then the war ended in 1714, and suddenly loads of privateers are out of work overnight. Oops. Thus begins the third round of piracy, which is probably the one you're thinking of when you think of pirates. This is kind of the Pirates of the Caribbean pirate era. Between 1714 and 1730 is the heyday of the most infamous pirates. Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, otherwise known as Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Henry Jennings, Edward Lowe, or Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the infamous female pirates. Loads of them knew each other because a lot of them were veterans from the War of Spanish Succession. So as a result, piracy was very organized. People had been gathering in Nassau and the Bahamas as kind of a pirate haven. The city was even established as a pirate city. And they were sailing with large fleets, terrorizing the North American coast and the Caribbean. And Britain was working round the clock to try to stamp out all the piracy. But by 1730, piracy decreased for a lot of reasons. This is because the majority of the most infamous pirates were dead by this point. The Royal Navy was a lot more powerful. Colonial governments that had previously been working with pirates, more on this later, were executing them in really large numbers. So it was just becoming too risky to be a pirate, and it really just wasn't worth it anymore. Then another war broke out, the War of Austrian Succession. And once again, pirates were pardoned if they became privateers to fight in the war, and the majority decided to do this. All right. So who were these pirates in general? Just going back to that a little bit. Why would someone want to become a pirate, especially if their capture nearly guaranteed a public execution via hanging? There are various answers for this. First, half of pirates during this era were white British American men. The rest were from all over Europe, Asia, Africa, all over the place. Pirate ships were the most diverse ships you could find. They did not have loyalty to any particular nation as a result. They considered themselves to be of their own nation. The pirate life was desirable for many people because it offered better opportunities, like I explained before. This is why a lot of people chose to become pirates despite the risk. They could find more of an egalitarian freedom on a ship, and they were able to make money much quicker than they ever would have made otherwise if they were lucky enough to survive. Now, piracy was the major impetus for Britain to expand maritime power across the Atlantic. And this is thanks to the growing High Court of Admiralty. And it's time to launch the war on pirates. So what is the High Court of Admiralty? The High Court of Admiralty was developed to take charge of all maritime legal matters when England became active during the Age of Exploration, or the 16th century. But technically, the High Court of Admiralty had actually been a ruling body since about the year 1260. By the 14th century, their official jurisdiction was defined as the seas or public rivers or fresh waters, streams, havens, or places subjected to overflowing whatsoever within the flowing and ebbing of the sea, upon the shores of banks whatsoever adjoining to them, or either of them from any of the said first bridges whatsoever, toward the sea throughout our kingdoms of England and Ireland, or our dominions aforesaid and elsewhere on the sea. Basically, any place that has enough water where you could sail or travel upon. King Henry VIII saw huge benefits with the Admiralty. In 1536, he passed a statute called the Offences of the Sea Act, which created England's first official law against piracy on the books, and it was also the first act to really declare the country to be an empire. So this is important in a lot of ways. This allowed the King's Justice to crack down on piracy no matter where the act was committed. Henry VIII's statute also put piracy under the specific jurisdiction of the High Court of Admiralty, but it also made piracy untriable by civil law. It's now up to the Admiralty's lawyers to determine if there was a case, not the general law courts. If so, quote, the Lord High Admiral issued a commission to Special Common Law Court of Oyer and Terminer, which had common law procedures and common law juries. The Central Court operated in London, so everyone had to be brought there for trial. This will be important in a bit. So the High Court of Admiralty becomes a really powerful entity in the 17th century. And this is because piracy was growing rapidly around and beyond England when the Royal Navy was neglected and fell into a bit of decay under the reign of King James I at the turn of the 17th century. The sudden rise of piracy created a need to support a specific legal institution to focus on these crimes. So the Admiralty's chief function is to protect merchant investments. How do you do this? You stamp out pirates, the #1 risk of any merchant. So in 1673, England reformed its laws to dictate that all pirates had to be specifically tried in Admiralty courts in order to combat piracy, or in courts that were headed by Admiralty officials. As Britain established themselves in the Caribbean and North America, the Admiralty's jurisdiction extended overseas. Now, one of the most important things that really helped establish the Admiralty's jurisdiction was the end of the Anglo-Spanish War with the passage of what's called the Treaty of Madrid. In this treaty, Britain is officially given the island of Jamaica. In return, Britain has to promise Spain to protect it from any British pirates. So Britain has to really start cracking down on piracy. But the problem is piracy is still flourishing no matter what. Piracy is so prevalent in and around Jamaica that in 1683, the Provost Marshal of Jamaica declared that any pirates who surrendered themselves would be granted a full pardon. Not only that, they could keep all of the loot that they already had. This sounds like a really lucrative thing. Like, why wouldn't pirates take this? They didn't. Many of them wouldn't do it. So officials decided they had to take this to a higher order. In 1698, King William III issued what's called the Act for the Effectual Suppression of Piracy, in which he declared that all piracies, felonies, and robberies committed upon the sea or in any haven, river, creek, or place where the admiral or admirals have power and jurisdiction, meaning that the Admiralty has full power to go after pirates. But piracy is still increasing. So a year later, the act is updated. Anyone who is committing any sort of piracy or robbery can get a full pardon. And not only this, local colonies now have the power to arrest pirates as they saw fit and would have them shipped back to England. But still, piracy continues to grow. So it's time now to expand the Admiralty's jurisdiction. So pirates are so numerous, it's becoming really unfeasible to actually ship them back to Jamaica, or I'm sorry, to ship them back to London. So they begin establishing courts in Jamaica. And these were established in Santiago de la Vega with Supreme Court judges who had all the same power as the Supreme Court judges in England. The same orders and when I say orders, I mean orders for all the legal officials to operate exactly as they would have in England. Bit of a big deal because up until this point, local governors kind of had their own methods and now they had to really conform to England's. And the same orders are imposed in Barbados and also in all the North American colonies. Now, the New England colonies, which relied on maritime-based economies in order to thrive, they were probably the most vigilant of the North American colonies to try to capture and execute pirates. And so this actually allowed a lot of places in New England to establish their own power that in some ways could even go beyond the High Court of Admiralty. Now in 1701, this new clause was added to the Act for the Effectual Suppression of Piracy. If a pirate gave evidence against their commanding officers or any fellow crew members, then the pirate would be pardoned and rewarded. They could get up to £100 for turning in a commanding officer and £20 for, quote, every inferior person. Not only that, they could keep all of their prizes, all of their loot. But that didn't mean that some pirates didn't go unpunished. You see, until the pirate could prove that the people he was naming were real pirates, he was put in prison until they were able to confirm that the names were correct. Sometimes the pirate's goods were not returned to him. And worst of all, sometimes a pirate could actually be sentenced to transportation for hard labor in the colonies or forced to join the Navy. After all, they're very skilled seamen who have loads of uses for all kinds of maritime work. For the most part, though, pirates who came forward were pardoned, especially if they had someone willing to vouch for their character. Other circumstances, such as their youth, might also grant a pirate a pardon. This was the case with a pirate named Robert Seeley, who sailed under Henry Avery as a teenager. If pirates were captured but able to prove they could be useful members of society, they might be set free. Good character witnesses had to vouch for their prior good behavior, steady work, family values and support, and a sober and honest living with good reputation in their community. But what happens if a pirate can't get a pardon and the pirate is captured and put on trial and then convicted? So we're now going to move on into the public execution process. And for this bit, I'm focusing on criminal law and the process as carried out in early modern London, because that's where the laws came from, which were implemented in Britain's overseas colonies. So this is all coming from a very Anglo-English perspective here. So the death sentence has been one of the most common punishments for convicted criminals since the very earliest of human civilization. So it's no surprise that they would eventually become public events. And this was a way for the state to be able to demonstrate power. Public executions via hanging in London were very common occurrences, and they made for good entertainment for anyone who could attend. Hundreds, if not thousands of people would show up for a hanging. There were vendors selling food and drink for people to enjoy themselves. And they really took off as public events starting in as early as the 13th century with the purpose of publicly shaming and persecuting traitors and common criminals. Public executions would increase in the 16th century when what's called the Tyburn tree, also known as the gallows, was erected in 1571. If any of you know your London geography, this is in West London, just outside of Marble Arch Tube Station on the corner of Hyde Park. There's a plaque on the ground. So if you ever travel there, you can find the location of the Tyburn tree. And this is the place where pretty much all petty criminals and highwaymen, robbers, et cetera, were executed. Now, execution dock, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, also became known as a public execution site. It was actually fully functioning since the 15th century, specifically for maritime criminals. Why? What's the difference here? Why is execution dock specifically for maritime criminals? It's because it's on the river. It's on the Thames, so it symbolizes where the crime took place. Now, this image here is on the bank of the Thames in the neighborhood Wapping. This is a replica of the approximate location of where execution dock may have been. The dock itself was taken down in the 1800s. If any of you are ever in London, go to a pub on Wapping High Street called the Prospect of Whitby, right here, where you can get a nice view of this replica noose. All right, so eventually, because maritime criminals were executed at execution dock, the location became pretty much synonymous with pirates, and their hangings drew crowds of thousands of people. All right, so for this bit of the lecture, when I'm talking about public executions now, I'm specifically going to be referring to execution dock. And anytime I say the word victim or criminal or deceased, etc., I'm always going to be referring specifically to pirates, just FYI. So between the 16th and the 18th centuries, the criminal trial underwent massive changes. For one thing, the definitions of murder and theft were expanded after the 16th century. Murder was divided up into capital and manslaughter, while theft became burglary and robbery. In order for you to be a pirate, you had to commit two crimes, murder and robbery, on the high seas. That's all it took to be named as a pirate. The self-informing jury system declined and focused prosecution developed in earnest, so really focusing on the person on the stand. The days where the defendant had to kind of tell his tale to the audience to convince people himself of his innocence were over. Now it was time for professionals to really make the decision. But here's the thing, the bench now could sum up the evidence themselves. They would comment on the defendant's story, but they always kind of had their agenda. And so as a result, before the criminal is brought into the court, the jury has pretty much already decided their fate. To put it in plain English here, in regards to pirates, they all arrived presumed guilty before being proved innocent. This was the case for Captain Kidd and pretty much all pirates who came after him. So for example, speaking of Kidd, this is a quote from Justice Turton, the man who presided over Kidd's trial, who addressed the jury after presenting the final piece of evidence. "Gentlemen, the business you are to inquire into is the piratical taking of these ships. Witnesses have positively and directly proved not only the taking of the ships, but the seizing of the goods and selling them and sharing the money. If these witnesses say true, as nothing appears contrary by the prisoners cross-examining them or otherwise, they are not at all contradicted or their credibility made questionable. They are most likely to know what was done, being with them in the whole voyage and engage with them in those enterprises. And if you give entire credit to witnesses, you will probably find these persons guilty of the piracy they are charged with, which I leave to your consideration." So the language basically here is clear. Kidd's fate was predetermined, and his punishment, the noose at execution dock. Now, it's one thing to impose a death penalty, but it's quite another to make it a public event. Why subject the victim to such public humiliation? The reason is because in England, crimes were seen as direct attacks against the monarchy and thus the country by extension. A crime against the people was a crime against the monarch, and who thus became the actual victim, the real victim. Pirates were known to specifically attack property, which were considered to be direct hits against the monarch and therefore the country and therefore God, a whole system here. Pirates also declared themselves to be of no nation, like I said, and therefore they're the ultimate threat because it means that they might not have any qualms about hunting their countrymen. They put the English sovereigns at risk of looking weak because pirates openly subverted this highest authority. The balance between this violation of the law and the all-powerful sovereign had to be totally reestablished to maintain any sort of order here. Now, part of the humiliating execution was a specific ritual that the pirate would have to play. The sentenced pirate is carted from Newgate prisoner in the center of the city eastward towards Wapping. And this usually took place in the morning at low tide, which signifies the Admiralty's jurisdiction, which was all waterways up to the low tide mark. At the front of the procession, the silver Admiralty oar, right here, is held high and it sparkles in the little sun that London has to offer, signifying that a pirate was off to meet his death. Once at the scaffold, the spiritual counselor of Newgate Prison, right here, gave a speech that outlined the pirate's life and crimes and whether or not he showed any remorse or repentance, or a lack thereof. Once his speech was over, the pirate was expected to speak. The public execution speech was always really eagerly anticipated. The pirate had to name his crimes, atone for his crimes, and beg forgiveness, and then warn anyone from entering into a life of piracy. Of course, pirates being pirates, many refused to undertake the ritual. Excuse me. Some cursed their cruel captains, saying that harsh treatment on merchant and naval ships forced people into piracy, where life could be better. Others cursed the audience, those who dared show up to watch them hang. This was shocking, but also delightfully naughty. Some stayed silent. One pirate refused to speak, but tossed his hat into the crowd, much to the public's delight. Not only that, public executions were an additional means of punishment because they were torture for both the pirate and the audience. The pirate to humiliate them as much as possible, for the audience to warn them against becoming pirates or against sympathizing with pirates. The death itself was long and drawn out. You see, pirates were given a shorter noose to extend their punishment. They would not die via a broken neck, but instead through suffocation, which could take up to an hour. Unlike burnings, where families could purchase a sack of gunpowder to hang around their condemned relative's neck to provide quick passage, pirates received no mercy because no one wanted to be associated with the pirate. So the pirate's limbs would jerk uncontrollably during the struggle, and this became known as the Marshal's Dance, facetiously named after the Admiralty Marshal who carried out the sentence. Sometimes friends or sympathizers maybe might pull on the victim's leg to break his neck and thus end the misery, but this was very rare. Once the person was dead, then the pirate was put into a gibbet until three tides washed over him. Right. All right, so we've taken a look here at what the public execution ritual was. We've looked at what the High Court of Admiralty was like in the Caribbean and what the process there was. Let's take a look at public executions now specifically in the Americas. So first we're going to look, I'm missing a map. I meant to put a map of the Caribbean, but I forgot. Sorry, guys. Anyways, let's turn to the Caribbean. Here we go. So we're now going to turn to the Caribbean, which is where pirates were the most active. So we have to go a bit into the relationship between pirate and colony because this is quite complicated. So first off, just to kind of point out, here's Florida, here are the Bahamas, the island of New Providence, right, is about right here, and the major city on it is Nassau, which will eventually become a pirate haven in the 1700s. Jamaica, so you know, is right here. Port Royal is a little spit of land jutting out just outside of Kingston, Jamaica's capital today. And this was initially a pirate haven in the 1600s during the War of the English-Spanish War. So as we've learned, the British were at odds with the Spanish, to put it mildly, for control of the Caribbean islands. Not only that, Britain wanted to show all of its European competitors, such as the French, that they were the most powerful nation. So how do they do this? The British have to cripple all the rivals' trades. So in 1651, Britain passed a law called the Navigation Acts, which would be reissued for the next 50 years, 50. This law banned all British colonists in the West Indies and North America from trading with anyone outside Britain or any of its holdings. This meant that suddenly colonists lost loads of access to international goods that they wanted, such as Madeira wine, certain textiles, and certain spices. If they could get these items, they were extremely expensive. It wasn't just colonists who were upset about this. Merchants resented the fact that they couldn't sell goods that had made them lots of money. Not only that, they feared that people would start turning to pirates and smugglers to get these sorts of goods, which they did. Sure enough, that's what happened. And it didn't help that local governors often either turned a blind eye to pirates or outright worked with them, such as Nicholas Trott, who was governor of the Bahamas during the 1690s, and Lord Archibald Hamilton, who was governor of Jamaica between 1711 and 1716. The fact of the matter was, punishing pirates could harm Caribbean economies. But this didn't stop British authorities from trying to get rid of pirates. Local officials had the power to capture, try, and execute pirates as they saw fit in their own way. However, as piracy grew to the point where it became impossible to transport them back to London, Britain began cracking down on legal proceedings and demanded that Jamaica had to become the hub of pirate persecution in the West Indies. And this is because it was the most powerful colony, which meant it had the most piracy kind of around it. So it makes sense. Admiralty courts were set up, and they had to use the exact same laws that were used in England. Governors had to be contended with because it's hard to enforce this from so far away. So Britain began planting governors who would be loyal to the Admiralty system. Not only that, citizens' loyalty was very essential, but it was also hard to guarantee. So piracy and illegal trade created a rift between colonists and the crown, because colonists, they found pirates useful. They're bringing in the goods that they don't want. And a lot of colonists and governors are resenting this massive crackdown of British law having to be really implemented. So to challenge any colonists from working with pirates, another law was put in, and this was to charge anyone colluding with pirates as pirates themselves. So people could no longer work with pirates at risk of their own arrest. So how were the trials and executions carried out here? Courts, like I said, were established in Santiago de la Vega, and executions were performed in Port Royal, the pirate haven. So a lot of good symbolism here. The courts were organized in a very similar judicial system as was done in England. And so the trials were done in a very similar fashion. Pirates were assumed guilty unless they could be proven innocent. All of this was recorded in council minutes, many of which you can even find online and read for yourself. Group trials of executions of pirates were really common. Once a pirate was found guilty, death sentences had to be carried out within 28 days, unless they were convicted specifically in Port Royal. In that instance, they would have to be executed within 10 days of their sentence, such as the case was for Calico Jack Rackham, who was executed in November 1720, just 10 days after his own sentence. The actual execution was carried out a little bit differently in Jamaica, but we don't actually have very many historical records. We don't have very large processions, but we do know that there was an Admiralty oar that was used, and that they were common events. But unfortunately, due to lack of records, I can't go into too much detail. Thus is the bane of a historian's existence. Now, here's the thing. The reactions in the Caribbean were a lot different than those in London. And this is because in London, people knew about pirates abstractly. They didn't know them personally. They weren't as personally affected. So they were more of these fascinating criminals who came from kind of these adventurous, but really dangerous lives overseas. In the West Indies, though, the attitudes were quite different. Remember, many colonists enjoyed benefits from piracy. Not only that, many pirates had families and were even upstanding members of their communities. In 1716, Governor Lord Hamilton of Jamaica wrote to the Council of Trade and Plantations describing a mob at a pirate's execution in Port Royal. Before the man could hang, people rushed forward and rescued this pirate from the gallows. Similar in England, some pirates could be set free if they had character witnesses or some sort of proof that they could become reformed citizens. But as many of them had families, this was a particular concern for their wives and children who could be ostracized from society or fall into destitution. So, for example, in 1701, a group of 42 women signed a petition begging Queen Anne to pardon their husbands. Your petitioners most humbly pray your great majesty's gracious and merciful consideration. What they're asking is saying, please pardon our husbands so that way we don't fall into destitution. They will become useful members of society. They'll sail for you. They'll never commit these crimes again. Unfortunately, though, Queen Anne would not heed their request. Let's now turn our attention to the North American colonies, where things could get even more complicated. In some cases, there was more of a struggle between colonist and crown, but it also really depended on their situation in terms of how they could rule themselves. So royal colonies, such as Virginia, were run by crown-appointed governors responsible for making sure that English laws were upheld. Proprietary colonies, such as Pennsylvania, were given land grants to wealthy investors with the purpose of establishing new colonists. Charter colonies, such as Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, were tied to English law, but they had the freedom to create their own governments. So 3 types of governments, 3 types of pirate relationships. Massachusetts and Connecticut worked really hard to eradicate piracy because they had very maritime-based economies with the fishing and the logging industry. Pennsylvania actually became an unknown pirate haven, specifically in Philadelphia, and also in Rhode Island as well. They were known as being receptacles for pirates, and this was because of all the active merchant trading coming in. Instead of it really harming the merchant trade like it was doing with Massachusetts and Connecticut, for example, pirates are smuggling in lots of really awesome goods in the mid-Atlantic colonies. Southern colonies such as Virginia had to work really hard to implement Admiralty law, but they did it in their own way. And they were able to do this because distance is always really convenient. The problem is, though, as piracy really began to grow, once again, the British came in and said, you need to establish your Admiralty courts. You need to try and execute pirates exactly as it's done in England. A lot of colonists, especially in Virginia, did not like this because they had actually enjoyed a lot of their own freedom to carry out laws for themselves. So now they're suddenly having this freedom taken away. And this caused a lot of resentment from governors against England because they could no longer do it themselves. Not only that, smuggled goods, very similar to the West Indies, were now pretty much null and void. So how is piracy eventually going to end? Because I said that by the 1720s and 30, about 1730, pirates pretty much ended. A lot of historians count this guy as one of the big key factors in eradicating piracy. And this is Governor Woodes Rogers, who became governor of the Bahamas around 1717. He was a former pirate hunter, and he became a royal governor, and his job was to stamp out piracy. Bit of a tricky job, though, because he actually didn't have any support from any government, because the Bahamas aren't really a producing colony. But the area he's focusing on is Nassau, on the island of Providence within the Bahamas, which is known as a pirate city, established by the former privateer Benjamin Hornigold. And this had become kind of a major pirate haven. Now, Woodes Rogers did have some success. He issued a proclamation immediately for any pirate to come forward, take a pardon by September 5th, 1718, and they'll be forgiven. 200 pirates did take the pardon, but within a couple of years, 100 of them went back into piracy. But Woodes Rogers was able to protect everyone, or protect the colony, and he was able to actually execute many pirates. But by the 1725, all the major pirate leaders had been, by 1725, all major pirate captains had been executed. The war is starting to break out. The Admiralty has become very powerful. And not only that, the Royal Navy has become very powerful. And so all of these factors eventually contributed to the end of what we call the golden age of piracy. And from that day on, at least in the Atlantic world, even though there were isolated cases of piracy, we never again saw any organized bands of massive amounts of piracy like we did during this time period. So. Thank you very much. Lots of information, I know. And thank you so much for coming. This is my information. If you want to find me, is my email. You can find me on Twitter, Beckalex, TikTok. I do daily pirate facts, Pirate Beckalex. And my website is rebecca-simon.com. And here's a list of suggested readings that if anyone is interested in looking at this further. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Simon. That was fascinating. Every time I spend time with you, I learn something new. I love it. And I will tell everyone, do follow her on TikTok. She does a lot of shorts about pirates, so it's really interesting. It's really fun. So let's get into the questions. I see that we already have quite a few questions here in the Q&A box. So I'm just going to get right into it, and I'm going to read you some questions, and let's see where we go from there. So Mike has asked, in your book, you talk about the definition of pirates and mention the Golden Age ended in 1730. The question is more or less about the capture of oil tankers off of the coast of Somalia. Does that actually meet the definition of pirates?
This is kind of a complicated question because a lot of maritime law hasn't been updated very much since the 1800s, and the jurisdiction's always a little a bit strange. Now, Somali pirates in general, yes, they rob people, but they aren't, as far as I know, quite known for killing as many people, which it would be the traditional definition. But in terms of a lot of the powerful countries that are getting robbed by the Somalian pirates. They're known as pirates in Somalia themselves, not quite so much. I'm not very educated about Somalian piracy, so that's probably about as much detail as I can get into before speculating, and I don't want to make a mistake. So, but I think it really just kind of depends on what the current maritime law is, which is different everywhere, and also kind of the context.
Interesting. And so staying on this definition topic, Richard had asked about privateers. Privateer pirates, are they a completely separate category?
That's a good question, because historians are debating about this all the time. Some say that privateers are not pirates, some say privateers are pirates. I think it depends on the privateer, because basically privateering is legally sanctioned piracy. I think it really depends on what happens after their letter of marque expires, because there were many privateers who just continued their actions after their letter of marque expired and thus become pirates. But there were some who actually would end up working for the government or become pirate hunters. So it really kind of it has to do with intention. But if you just simply look at the law itself, privateers are working for a government and therefore legally sanctioned to do what they're doing. So technically, legally speaking, a privateer is not a pirate.
Interesting. And so Mick actually had a question of something that we were talking about earlier. And why reference persecution of pirates? Wouldn't prosecution have been a better term? After all, they were thieves and at time murderers.
Both terms really work. So the way I've always kind of defined it, prosecution really has to do with the actual practice of putting them on trial and condemning them and finding them guilty. Persecuting means kind of the chase of going after them and really trying to take pirates down. And this was known in a way as the war on piracy, where the British were doing everything they could to eradicate pirates, not just by arresting them, but also by trying to persuade public opinion against piracy as well. So that way they were being persecuted technically and also persecuted kind of socially as well.
Good. That was a really good answer, because I was actually at one point I was looking up the definition, and the actual legal terms of it are exactly as you say. Persecution is actually going after them, whereas prosecute is a legal process. So really good that we cleared that up for a lot of people. Avi wants to know, given that offer of full pardon and keeping the plunder, why did piracy continue to grow?
The reason why piracy continued to grow was because a lot of people were seeing really lucrative opportunities with piracy. So piracy especially grew at the turn of the 18th century. And this is because the wars, so the Anglo-Spanish War had ended. So a lot of people thought as privateers were out of work and went into piracy. And the same thing happened after the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, when pretty much all privateers became unemployed overnight. So that's why piracy massively increased. Also, as colonization is increasing and more people are going into the Americas, maritime trade is massively increasing. So there's a lot more opportunity for plunder at the same time. Pirates were also very loath to turn each other in. They were generally very loyal to each other. And during the third round of the Golden Age of piracy, many referred to themselves as a brethren. So this is also another reason why piracy really continued to grow, was because they just didn't want to turn themselves in, because many were out of work due to the end of conflicts, and also because of rising trade and colonization that just allowed for more opportunities for plunder.
Interesting. And I'm going to combine these two questions. So we have two questions. One is Brianna's asking, was it common for pirates to turn in their crewmates? And then Richard had asked, did anyone ever really walk a plank?
So it wasn't super common for pirates to turn in their crewmates, but there were pirates who spoke against their crewmates. For instance, Captain Kidd is put on the stand for trial and he's saying he's innocent of piracy. But remember, his crew is threatening to mutiny and they're very angry that he killed a fellow crewmate. So all the crew members who Kidd thought would speak for him came to the trial to speak out against him. If there were pirate ships where they had captured and forced people into piracy, which was really common, most of those people who were forced into piracy would speak out against the pirates on the ship, especially as they were trying to be proven innocent. So yeah, there were occasions when, depending on the situation, when crew members might actually turn in or speak out against their crewmates. As for walking the plank, this really kind of comes from pop culture. There aren't really any records of anyone walking a plank. Pirates might maroon people, leaving them on, deserting them on a small island somewhere. But as for walking a plank, no, that didn't really happen. Sometimes there was keel hauling, a horrific punishment where you were tied to a rope, thrown overboard, and your body would like drag underneath the ship and you get torn up by all the barnacles and stuff that it attached. And that usually either you drowned or you would die of your wounds later. But as for walking the plank, that's pretty fiction.
The other is worse. So.
Yeah.
I think we could do a few more questions. I think this is a good question to talk about the upcoming book that you actually have. So Paul said he spent years trying to find out what happened to Anne Bonny after her capture. He tracked her to Virginia. Do you have any insights?
Yeah, so there's a few theories. So the biggest theory is similar to what Paul tracked. So a lot of historians accept that most likely she was probably maybe bailed out of prison by her father and went home to North Carolina, which is where her father lived, got married and had children and lived up to about till 1782. Now the reason this is plausible because she was sentenced to death, but she was pregnant on the stand. And so she received what was called a stay of execution, meaning that her execution would be postponed until after the birth of the child. But 9 times out of 10, women who are sentenced to be executed were never actually executed. They were usually let go after a certain time. So that's possible. But actually about a little over a year ago, a YouTuber, I forget his name, came across some documents for a listing of death records for St. Catherine's Parish, which is in Jamaica, where St. Iago de la Vega is, and found Anne Bonny, found the name Anne Bonny listed as being buried in 1732. So if this is the same Anne Bonny, it's possible she lived the rest of her life out in Jamaica in some fashion. This is very new evidence, so it's really interesting to explore, but we probably won't ever know the full story.
Interesting. So I think we have time for one more question. We're not going to get to all of them, but I will pose this one from David to you, which is, how did the pirates use their stolen plunder? Did they market it to others, sell it in the markets, or just use what they needed?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So when pirates were stealing goods, about 50% were intended to sell and 50% were meant for themselves. So a lot of the big thing that pirates were after, they weren't really after money, gold, and jewels for the most part. I mean, if ships had them, awesome bonus. That would be great. But they were really looking for goods they could sell and also goods they could use to replenish their own stores and also to repair their ships. So 50% of everything they took were foodstuffs that would last a while, certain types of line and tackle and canvas. And then they would go after things like wines and textiles, sugar, sometimes enslaved people, because they were considered property. History is gross, to put it lightly. And the whole purpose was for them to be able to sell these items once they were able to get to shore and go to places where they knew they could do this. And this would give them money to repair the ship, restock their ship, for them to maybe send money home to their families, keep the money for themselves. But most commonly, they would go and spend it in taverns and on women. So the money they would make was kind of for themselves. When they had support of the colonies, then they would also even have sometimes financiers who they would use this plunder to kind of pay them back. So it was kind of a lucrative endeavor for a lot of people.
Interesting. Thank you. That was a good way to wrap up. I just want to, again, just shout out your book, which we have signed copies for. We're going to post a link in the chat now if you want a copy. And then we also will have the 5-week live online class, which starts on February 21st with Dr. Rebecca Simon. And I'm going to leave the Zoom room open with that up, just in case anyone would like to read more about it, sign up. But I want to turn to you, Dr. Simon, and ask if you have any closing remarks.
Oh gosh. Well, Thank you so much. This is a topic I really love. There's so much more I wish I could have covered, such as kind of how people reacted to it and publications that came out about piracy. I would say if people are kind of interested in looking at how pirates are really portrayed, to check out primary sources, such as the Buccaneers of America, written by Alexander Exquemelin, which you can find on Amazon. The book, A General History of the Pirates, is an interesting source because it's a collection of pirate biographies published in 1724 that's still in print. Take it with a grain of salt, though. Much of it is fictionalized, but it still gives you kind of an interesting perspective of how people may have viewed pirates. And also you'll notice it kind of really sort of affects how pop culture has really been influenced by it in terms of piracy in general. So yeah, it's a big thing I always like to take for people to take away is knowing that piracy is a lot more complicated than we think. It's definitely not black or white. Many people went in because they were cruel and because they wanted to rob and murder and everything like that. But that was actually kind of the minority. Most pirates usually only wanted to be a pirate for a year or two so they could get wealthy and retire if they were lucky. So, and the law is very fascinating because it changes all the time in order to try to figure out how to stop piracy, but much of it just didn't work. So very complicated, very interesting stuff. And I hope that this maybe has inspired some people to become more interested in learning about pirates.
Yeah, and everyone can join the course. We have 30 spots available. It is limited to 30 people. So if you'd like to join that course, it starts in 2 weeks with Dr. Rebecca Simon, who is going to take you through 5 live sessions. But I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And this was really fascinating. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yep, see you in 2 weeks.